Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, guys, because at 1 o'clock, I'm teaching the Contracts 101 class, part 4, about amendments and terminations. So today we're going to talk about the proper use of proper handling of earnest money. And I know I spoke briefly with Angie, and she wanted to make sure that it was conveyed to you guys that you need to turn your contracts in to the holder of the earnest money ASAP, simply because the holder of the earnest money would be the one to notify the parties if the earnest money isn't turned in according to the time frame detailed in the purchase and sale agreement contract. So that's number one. Number two, I will tell you that, and you all have heard me speak at different venues about allowing a closing attorney to hold earnest money. And I don't think it's ever a good idea to do so, just simply because the issues that I deal with as a broker is getting them to do what they're supposed to do if a buyer doesn't turn the earnest money in within the terms of the contract. That's the biggest thing, because as you know, or as you may not know, the holder of the earnest money, if it's not received within the time frame of the contract, then we have to notify the parties that it hasn't been received. At that point, the buyer has 3 banking days to make good on the funds and deliver the funds to be deposited. Or if they don't do that, then on the 4th day, the seller's remedies are to terminate the contract or move forward with the contract as if there were no earnest money. And I never think it's a good idea to move forward with a contract with no earnest money. Number one, because that's your seller's liquidated damages. And if there is a breach of contract or a default on that buyer's part, then there's no liquidated damages for the seller. And I had dealt with a situation late last week where a closing attorney was holding earnest money, and I don't know why our listing agent allowed this to happen, but they did. They gave the buyer 7 days to make good on the earnest money. And within that 7-day period, they had an appraisal. The appraisal came in short. The buyer's agent was arguing over the price, and yet we didn't even have earnest money. And all this was done. The earnest money should have been received, and I had to get involved. And they were like, "Well, if the seller's not going to reduce the price, we're not going to submit the earnest money." And guys, those are 2 separate issues. So if you are a listing agent, I want you to please use your best practice, and you need to collect that earnest money as soon as possible. Okay. Do not give that buyer 3 to 5 to 7 days to submit the earnest money, because if they default within that time frame before it's received, your seller has no liquidated damages. Okay. So I want to make sure everybody's clear on that. But the other thing that's very, very important is that you make sure that if your broker, if we're holding the earnest money, we need you to submit your contract immediately in command, so that if there's a default on the earnest money, we have the contract and we can send out the notice to cure the default. Now, last week, the notice was sent out on earnest money that had not been collected. And because Monday was a federal holiday, once that notice was given on Thursday, that buyer had until Wednesday of this past week, to submit their earnest money. And so that property that contract was active with no earnest money. And guess what? They wound up terminating. They were in default, and now the seller has no liquidated damages. So the handling of other people's money is the most important duty we have as realtors. Uh, the fastest way to real estate jail is to mishandle other people's money. And I can promise you that the Real Estate Commission will not tolerate the mishandling of funds, and you could be fined or suspended for mishandling other people's funds. So please be cognizant of that when you are representing a buyer. And quite frankly, if you're a listing agent, you need to make sure you get that earnest money. You need to follow up on it. That is also part of your responsibility, because that is your seller's liquidated damages if there is a default. Okay, so let's take a quick break and see if you all have any questions so far, or if there's anything I can tell you about the proper handling of earnest money. Anybody? Come on now, y'all, don't be quiet. Okay, so then we're going to move on. So if you decide to let the holder be the closing attorney, the other big mistake I see when I review contracts is that there are two documents that need to be, one needs to be initialed by the parties. That is the F510, closing attorney acting as holder of the earnest money. But more importantly, the F511, the agreement of the closing attorney to be the holder of the earnest money must be signed by that attorney. And I will see agents will take a contract and it'll have the F510 that the closing attorney is going to be the holder of the funds. And I can't tell you, 90% of the time, I have to send those contracts back as rejected because there is no executed F511. And it says right on the top of the form that they are both required. So I don't understand why that continues to be an issue, but it doesn't need to be an issue. And I'll tell you a little story of why it's important to get that signed by the closing attorney. Is that I dealt with an issue several years ago where the closing attorney was the actual holder of the earnest money and the F511 was never signed. Well, there was a dispute. The closing attorney had the earnest money, but they gave it to the wrong party because their reasoning was they never agreed to hold it. So the seller was supposed to get this earnest money, the buyer defaulted, and the closing attorney gave it to the buyer because they never signed the agreement to be the holder. And so in their minds, they awarded that money back to a buyer who defaulted on a contract. That's one of many examples I can tell you as a broker that I've dealt with closing attorneys holding earnest money. Your best bet is to have your broker within the Heart of Atlanta group hold your earnest money if at all possible, even in cases if you're the listing agent and and the buyer's agent wants some attorney you've never dealt with to be the holder of the funds. You should put your foot down and let them know that your seller wants your broker to hold the earnest money. And this is a discussion you should have with your sellers prior to accepting an offer, depending on who is going to be the holder of the earnest money. Because in my 26 years in real estate, I've never had to interplead funds. The holder of the earnest money, if there's a dispute, or if the seller won't sign a unilateral notice that the buyer sent, or we can't get a mutual agreement signed, then the holder of the earnest money has the right to disperse those funds based on a reasonable interpretation of the contract. And I got to tell you guys, in my years of being a broker, I've never had to interplead funds because the contract is usually pretty clear about what is to happen, and it's not that difficult to come up with a reasonable interpretation um, to disperse those funds. Are there any questions about that? Because I get those questions a lot, even though we discuss it a lot, um, about how that is handled. No? Okay. Um, well, just make sure that three takeaways. Number one, make sure your contract is turned in ASAP if we are the holder of the funds. If the closing attorney is the holder of the funds, which I'm advising you not to do, but I understand the reason for you to do it in certain cases, then you need to make sure that closing attorney receives that contract right away. And your responsibility is to stay on top of and track that earnest money has been collected and deposited, because that's just part of the duty that you have representing your client, whether the buyer or the seller. That's number one. Number two, make sure that on your contract that earnest money is turned in within I would say, no less than a 24-hour time frame once it goes binding. There's no reason to wait 3 to 5 to 7 days to collect that earnest money. No reason at all. So those are the big takeaways that I want you all to understand when you're dealing with earnest money. Barbara Dyer, I see you have joined this call. Help me out here and say something good.
Okay, well, good afternoon. How are you guys?
We're all good. How are you, Barbara?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you so very much for asking. What can I do for you, Tom?
I wanted to see if you had any input on what I've talked about. I mean, this is about the proper way to handle earnest money. It's not going to be an hour discussion, but nobody seems to have any questions about it. So we may have a very quick broker chat call today. But my advice, Barbara, is to have your broker hold the earnest money. We are better equipped to provide a 10-day letter if there's a dispute over the earnest money, 10-day letter interpretation of the contract, and disperse those funds accordingly. We are also in a better position if the funds aren't received per the terms of the contract to send out notice to the parties to allow that buyer to cure that default within 3 banking days, or the seller at that point can terminate the contract.
And you are absolutely correct, Tom. And
And
I
I
just
am
want,
not in favor of closing attorneys holding earnest money,
that is correct.
because they are not governed by the laws of the Real Estate Commission. And number one, guys, the reality of it is they don't want to hold it.
That's right.
They
They
don't
don't.
want to hold it. It's really not their job. Their job is to clear the title and prepare the documents for the parties to close.
You're right, Tom. And you know what? And I was surprised just last week when I was teaching a code of ethics class that a lot of people think that when you don't receive that earnest money, it's an automatic termination of the contract, and it is not.
No, it is not.
And I also want to just reiterate what you just mentioned. I always, whenever at all possible, even if I have to beat someone up, I always like for Keller Williams to hold the earnest money, because Tom is absolutely correct. Keller Williams will really be in your corner. They're not going to break any laws, but
No,
they'll fight for you to get that earnest money and to hold on to it. And he's right that the closing attorney is not governed by the same guidelines and policies and procedures that we are as realtors.
correct. Yeah, and again, the reason I said we should hold it is because we stay on top of the disbursement process. I have seen closing attorneys. I mean, these are all real life conversations I've had, guys. I've had one closing attorney up in North Cobb County tell me that if they were going to have to write a letter to disperse the funds, that he was going to charge them his hourly rate to do so. And I'm like, no, dude, you signed the agreement saying that you would hold the funds, and so you are to follow the guidelines detailed in that purchase to sell agreement, which means you have to send out a 10-day letter based on a reasonable interpretation of the contract and notify the parties of your decision. Now, I will say one thing I have not touched on is that if we send out a 10-day letter letting the parties know that we're dispersing the funds to either the buyer or the seller, that party has the right to send an objection to the holder, and then we have the right to reevaluate our decision. Now, with rare exception, I've never had to reverse my decision. I think I'll have to, it's been such a long time. I think that maybe a couple of times I was not given the whole story, and it wasn't clear what the process was that had happened, but that is very, very rare. Angie and I don't take lightly sending out a decision if we have not fully evaluated that contract. And I have seen closing attorneys put more value on the circumstances than the interpretation of the contract. Circumstances do not play into the decision making in dispersing earnest money. It's the interpretation of the written contract that allows the holder to disperse those funds, and based on that reasonable interpretation of the contract, not the circumstances around it. So, just want to make sure everybody is clear on that process, because I can't tell you, we discuss this a lot, and we still have agents asking questions that don't understand it. And that's fine. We're here to answer your questions and happily answer your questions. But guys, we're moving into a market where commissions are not going to be published.
Correct.
And so we have got to make sure our skill sets of professionalism and our sales skills and our contract knowledge are at top notch performance. The other thing I want to reiterate is that, please, if you're an agent who doesn't like to answer your phone, please answer your phone cheerfully and professionally, and let that other agent or party who's calling you feel your professionalism in that conversation. All right, let's see. I think there was something in the chat. Kadar, did you have a question? Let's
Yes, I
see.
did. I was wondering, because I know on the contract it'll say, 5 4 or 5 days after binding, you can agree to whenever you want to turn in earnest money. But is there a suggested best practice or a date range that you typically prefer to see or use, like 2 days after binding, 3 days after binding, something you prefer to use or suggest to the associates?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think before you came on, I'd address that.
Oh,
Uh,
sorry.
yeah, I mean, the best contract, guys, your strongest contract is when you send your contract along with a copy of that earnest money check. There is no reason, and I know that in today that we use a lot of technology to access earnest money with Earnest and apps and so on and so forth. And so sometimes a check is not appropriate. But I used to, back before, all of the modern technology, I used to always send a copy of the earnest money check. Now, that doesn't mean it was deposited, but it means that I'd sit down with my buyer, had a conversation with them about the process, and had them prepared to write a check when we wrote the offer on the property. So, Kadar, to answer your question, as soon as possible is the best language I can use. There's no need to wait 3 to 7 days to collect earnest money, because if you're a listing agent, uh, that is your seller's liquidated damages. And so I can't tell you how many times I have to have conversations because the earnest money hasn't been turned in, the buyer defaults on the contract, and the seller's stuck with no uh, uh, earnest money liquidated damages. And at that point, they're going to have to hire an attorney or go to small claims court to try and collect what should have already been deposited by the holder of those funds.
Would the brokerage be liable then because we didn't collect?
The brokerage could be held liable if we did not monitor the proper collection and deposit of those funds. If we didn't have the funds and we didn't notify the parties, which we are required to do as a holder, then we could be held liable. I know that when I first started as the managing broker in the Decatur office, there was a situation where the buyer's agent did not just forgot to collect the earnest money. Our seller never, our agent never caught it. It wasn't followed up on. And so I called that broker up and they had to stroke a check for $2,400. I remember it. Now, again, that's why it's important for you as agents, whether you're representing a buyer or a seller, to follow up and make sure not only that money has been collected, but you should be making another call to the whoever is handling the money in that particular office. With Keller Williams, it's our MCAs, and make sure that you get a copy of the proper deposit of those funds. I know that in Kadar's office, there was a situation a couple years ago where earnest money was collected via, I think, the Earnest app. And the buyer changed their mind and called their bank and said that it was fraudulent. And the beauty about Earnest was that once it's sent to them, if the buyer puts a stop payment on it, they will honor those funds. I believe that's the way it happened, right, Kadar?
Yeah, they did.
Barbara, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to add a little bit, Tom, to this earnest money and contract discussion.
Okay.
Another thing that our realtors need to be really careful about is that new construction contract because that builder is going to be holding that earnest money. They're more than likely not going to let Keller Williams hold the earnest money. And
Right.
there's language in that builder contract that's going to give you heartburn sometimes in
Yeah.
regards to that earnest money. And they may even have some extra fees associated with the return of that earnest money, even if they do refund the earnest money. They may charge you an administrative fee of $500 or so. So again, reading that contract for that new construction will tell you what the loopholes are or what you should be aware of.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. I will tell you that my experiences with most builders, home builders on new construction, they usually take a construction deposit, and there's generally no way they're ever going to give that back to the buyer if the buyer's unhappy with the construction, or they had we recently had an inspection, and the buyer wanted out of the contract, but the builder said, "I'll fix everything in that inspection report," and they did not get their construction deposit back, and it was quite substantial. So my only comment about new construction and working with builders is, number one, do your homework on that home builder before you decide to go under contract on something they are building. I don't think we do enough due diligence on the builder themselves, prior to going in. I think we get wrapped up in the fact that it's new construction and it looks really good, and we don't do our homework on that particular builder. And I would say that is a huge mistake, and you should reevaluate how you're handling that and working with builders. So just keep that in mind. Again, I've dealt with a lot of stuff you all have never dealt with. And so I'm just giving you my 2 cents worth in terms of what I think you all need to be paying attention to, other than just writing a contract for your buyer. I think that moving forward in real estate, we're going to have to be very, very professional. We're going to have to go out of our way to perform at a much higher level to earn the compensation that we're going to be receiving moving forward.
I agree with that 110 times 110.
Yeah. Be also, are there any other questions or concerns about earnest money and the proper handling of earnest money?
Kind of not a direct question, but a bit of a qualifier. But Lamar, you're coming off mute. Go ahead and ask.
Okay.
Yeah, hey, Tom.
Hey, Lamar.
I got a question regarding Earnest. Are there any that you know of? Are there any closing attorneys that have adopted the use of Earnest, or do they typically just, take
No,
a while?
not that I'm aware of. Again, I know that some of you came on a little late, and sorry about any confusion on our end about the link to today's call. But the bottom line is, closing attorneys don't want to hold earnest money. But it's not their job. They don't want to hold it. They do it as a courtesy, but they really, if you poll closing attorneys, they will tell you they don't want to hold it. And the issues that I have around the disbursement of earnest money when there's a dispute is that I've seen attorneys, and again, guys, it's no reflection on attorneys, but they're just not under the same guidelines that I am as a broker under Greg. And so I've seen attorneys make some really bad decisions about disbursement of earnest money. And my best advice, and you all know I preach this all the time if it ever comes up in any particular venue, is do not let a closing attorney hold earnest money. It's just not a good idea.
So on that same note, I oftentimes, especially with listings, I would, insist on the listing uh on the MLS that, Keller Williams Atlanta Classic holds the earnest money. However, an occasion where there may be an investor buyer who's comfortable and familiar with a certain closing attorney, they have all their information. Oftentimes the investors, they insist on using their closing attorney. And then some traditional buyers, in fact, um, don't feel comfortable with the broker, let alone the listing broker, holding their earnest money. So to make a deal happen, I often use the closing attorney as a backup, kind of a happy medium. So
Right.
neither broker holds it, fine. We have a third party, non-interested party, hold it, and we keep it moving. I didn't
Yeah.
know though that closing attorneys have a problem. I thought that was kind of their part of their, you know, job if they were called to do it.
It's not part of the closing attorney's job to be a holder of a buyer's earnest money. That's really the job of a broker. And so I think to respond, Lamar, I would say, yeah, you're correct. I mean, we can't not let an attorney hold it if that's what your investor buyer or your buyer wants to do. But I'm just telling you the pitfalls that I've dealt with over the years with closing attorneys holding earnest money. And so I'm just going to say that not all offers are good offers. Uh, so if there's an element that will be outside of your control, um, then you need to be cognizant of that and talk to your client about that. And ultimately, it's their decision. But I think my point is, we need to be trusted advisors. We need to step up our game. We need to come from a place of authority and guide our clients to where we feel they need to be. But ultimately, it's their decision. And I know that's kind of a broad topic, but I do think that you're going to be hearing a lot about it, at least from me, about um, sales skills, being able to convey information to your client in a very professional way and help them make the best decision that they can make. Ultimately, it's their decision. But when it comes to earnest money, if you're representing a seller, you need to understand that is their liquidated damages if a buyer defaults. So, if it's not collected properly, or if it's held by a broker or an attorney who really doesn't understand the contract, then your liquidated damages may not exist. So I think it's very something that we all need to think about, we all need to reflect on. And, there is no shoebox that everything fits in, to your point, Lamar. And sometimes you just have to make decisions to get a contract to the closing a table. Can you discuss the F510 versus the F511? They are both needed and lots of agents only submit one. Yeah, I covered that before you all joined. there are two documents. If a closing attorney is holding the earnest money, it's the F-510, which is the closing attorney acting as holder of the earnest money. That needs to be initialed by the parties. And then what most people forget is the F-511, the agreement of the closing attorney to hold the earnest money. That has to be signed by the closing attorney who is acting as the holder. And so it shouldn't be very confusing. It says right at the top of the form, if the closing attorney is holding it, then the F-511 is also required, but 90% of the time I have to send contracts back because it's not in the file. And the example, Kadar, that I used was I had a closing attorney where the earnest money should have gone to the seller, and the closing attorney gave it back to the buyer because they never signed the F-511 and said, we never agreed to be the holder. So there you go. Real life story.
And Tom,
Yes.
this is Barbara again.
Hey.
I want to just say that if we're getting a lot of realtors that are turning in the contract without the F-510 and the F-511, then we need to rethink how well are we really representing our clients. Because
Correct.
if you're reading your contract, it says on the purchase and sale agreement under the holder of the earnest money that you also need to have that 510 and that 511. So
that's right.
That goes back to us being professional, representing our clients, reading the documents that they're signing, and they should not be able to tell us what's in our document better than we can tell them what's in our document. So
thank you.
If we are getting contracts turned in without the F-510 and the F-511, we're not taking our craft serious at all. That's our responsibility.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. I totally agree with that statement. That's why I wanted you guys to understand that my goal is to explain to you the processes and the proper handling, in this case of earnest money, but we as professionals have to step up our game and make sure that we are doing everything we can. And it all boils down to professional sales skills. Okay. And moving forward, when there are going to be times where the seller is not offering compensation for you as a buyer's agent, you better step up your game and prove your value. These are things that I've talked about all spring season. And now we are a month away from when the advertising of compensation is going away. And I just want everybody to be on in top form. You need to understand everything that we have going on with these contracts. And more important, you need to step up your sales skills to just make that part of what you offer to a buyer or seller. Thank you, Barbara.
My pleasure. And Tom, can I have another little plug?
Of course.
The National Association of Realtors is offering the accredited buyer representation designation free this year to our realtor members.
Are you talking about the accredited buyer?
The ABR, yes.
Yeah, yep. I have been on the bandwagon about that. I think if you work with buyers, you need to get that designation. It was very, very big back in the day when I first started in real estate, because that's before we had buyer brokerage agreements. And we got those designations because we wanted to be the experts that could assist those buyers at the time. And now I think that it's a very important thing for you to take advantage of, to get that designation, so that when you're sitting down and having a professional buyer consultation, that you can let them know that you have a designation as an accredited buyer representative. Very important.
And they can
Thank you,
take it free,
Barbara.
and they can take it free from the National Association of Realtors.
Do you have a link you can post on the chat?
Let me see if I can find it before we
Well,
get
I
off.
tell you what, Barbara, send it to me, guys, and I'll post it in Broker News and Circle. How about that?
Okay, I can definitely do that, Tom.
Everybody will get it, and Barbara, you can just send it to me and I'll take care of it.
I sure will. Thank
That
you.
means y'all gotta
Awesome.
log into Circle.
All right, guys. Well, it is 12:45. I don't think anybody else has any comments or questions. I've got to, if you are available and want to join me at 1 o'clock for part 4 of Contracts 101, I'll be leading that on amendments and terminations. And then next week, I'm going to be out of town on Monday. So Angie's going to take over for me for part 1 of Contracts 101, preparing to write your offer. All right. Well, I appreciate you all taking the time to join me today. I hope this was informative. We are always here. If you need a question answered, please email us at broker@heart, HEARTATL.com. That will come to my email. It'll come to Angie's email, and one of us will get back with you as quickly as we can. All right.
One more time,
Thanks a
that was
bunch. broker@heart, HEARTATL.com.
And Tom, what's the link for today's call at 1?
What's now what, Barbara?
What's the link for the call at 1 o'clock?
It should be out already. Our Zoom assistant is on the call right now, and he will get that link out.
Thank
if
you.
It's not already out.
Thank you.
Okay. Y'all have a good afternoon. Have a great week.
All right, thank you.
You as well.
Right.
Bye-bye.